The shift didn't start with control. It started with correction. I was chairing a community board meeting I didn't want to attend, sitting in a converted school auditorium with bad acoustics and folding chairs that pinched the backs of my legs. I was there as a formality, until a detail was adjusted publicly, calmly, and in a way that made my authority feel suddenly imprecise. I funded 2 of the initiatives on the agenda, which meant my presence signaled stability even when my attention drifted. He raised his hand only once. When he spoke, he didn't challenge the point I'd made. He adjusted a detail, a zoning date, a clause number. He did it without emphasis, as if accuracy mattered more than credit. I glanced down at my notes and saw he was right. After the meeting, he waited while people clustered around me. He didn't hover. When he finally approached, he introduced himself with his full name and said he worked in compliance for nonprofit housing projects. He said he admired how efficiently I cut through sentiment earlier. He said most people mistook urgency for importance. That felt specific enough to stay with me. We walked out together. He said he was new to the city, that he'd relocated for a short-term contract. He asked if the board always ran that long or if tonight had been unusual. It was a practical question. I answered it. I was 52 then. My money came from a logistics company I built with my brother and sold 10 years earlier. Since then, I sat on boards, funded projects selectively, and kept my days structured. I wasn't looking for anything. That mattered to me. He didn't ask for my number. He asked if I usually stayed after meetings or left immediately. When I said I sometimes went for a drink nearby, he said he'd join if I was already going, but that he understood if I wasn't. I went. At the bar, he ordered seltzer with lime. He said he'd learned early not to drink around other people's decisions. He spoke about regulations the way some people talk about architecture, load-bearing elements, stress points. He said most disasters weren't caused by greed, but by impatience layered over good intentions. I noticed how he framed risk as something neutral. He told me he'd left a long marriage recently. No drama, he said. Just erosion. He said he preferred systems to emotions because systems could be audited. I didn't disagree. When we stood to leave, he asked if he could email me a document, a summary he'd written about a funding loophole the board hadn't addressed. He said it might save me time later. I gave him my work address. The email arrived the next morning. Clean, concise, no flirtation, just information I could use. At the bottom, a single line. If this is redundant, feel free to ignore. I didn't ignore it. Over the next weeks, we crossed paths deliberately but not frequently. Another meeting, a site visit. He was always prepared, always slightly behind me, never in front. He didn't flatter my decisions. He contextualized them. One afternoon, after a long inspection, he said he admired how I delegated authority without surrendering oversight. He said most people confused the two. He said it was rare to see done well. That night, when I replayed the day, I didn't think about attraction. I thought about alignment. It seemed reasonable to see him again. Our connection formalized without romance. He became someone I consulted. Not officially. Just a name I forwarded things to when language felt slippery or implications were buried. He never replied immediately. He always replied precisely. If he didn't know, he said so. That restraint built weight. We started having lunches after meetings. Short ones. He timed them to my schedule and left before I did. He talked about his work in terms of exposure and mitigation. He said his job was to stand between good intentions and expensive mistakes. I liked that framing. It matched how I saw my own role. At some point, I realized I was telling him things I didn't tell my peers. Not secrets. Assessments. Where I felt resistance. Which board members worried me. He didn't store the information like leverage. He used it to explain dynamics. That felt collaborative. He didn't touch me for weeks. When he did, it was incidental. A hand at my elbow crossing a street. Fingers brushing as he passed me a folder. It registered, then passed. He never amplified it. That made it feel unexploited. The first personal request came dressed as concern. He said he was uneasy about a structure we were funding. Not the mission, but the paperwork. He said there was a risk I was personally insulated from, but that the organization wasn't. He said if something went wrong, my name wouldn't be damaged, but the people involved might be. I asked what he'd recommend. He said a legal review independent. He said he could introduce me to someone, but that it might look cleaner if the engagement came through a private channel. Less noise. Fewer politics. That sounded reasonable. The attorney he recommended was competent. Expensive but efficient. I paid without thinking about it as a favor. It was an operational expense. He thanked me for taking the issue seriously. After that, his presence increased slightly. More calls. More incidental overlap. He framed it as proximity to a live issue. When the review concluded without incident, he seemed relieved, almost proud. He said most people preferred not to look too closely. We had dinner that night. Real dinner, not lunch. He said he appreciated how decisively I acted. He said decisiveness was rare in people who didn't need to prove anything. He said he found that attractive. He didn't wait for my response. He just let the statement sit. When I invited him home, it felt like a continuation, not a change. He didn't stay the night. He said he had an early call with the East Coast. He said it matter-of-factly. I noticed how often he left before intimacy could create expectation. Over the next months, he became embedded in my periphery. He didn't meet my friends socially. He met them professionally. He didn't ask to be included. He made himself useful. He began flagging risks preemptively. Potential conflicts. Optics issues. Gray areas that could become expensive. I relied on him because his caution saved time. It saved me from mistakes I didn't want to make. When he told me his contract was ending, it came as context, not crisis. He said the work was cyclical. He said he preferred it that way. He said permanence made people careless. I didn't offer him anything. Not yet. What I did was loop him into more conversations. I introduced him as someone I trusted. That word landed cleanly. He didn't correct it. Later, alone, he said he valued how deliberately I used language. He said trust wasn't a feeling. It was an infrastructure. That phrase stayed. By then, I wasn't thinking about where this was going. I was thinking about how well it functioned. The invitation didn't come as a favor. It came as a correction. We were reviewing a funding structure that afternoon. One with too many intermediaries and not enough accountability. He said the issue wasn't legality, but distance. Too many layers between intent and execution. He said things like that tended to fail quietly, then catastrophically. He suggested a workaround. A temporary oversight role. Not public-facing. Just enough authority to compress decision-making and reduce exposure. He said it would require someone neutral. Someone not tied to the organization's internal politics. He said my name wouldn't be appropriate. He said his might be. I asked how temporary. He said 3 to 6 months. He said it would end automatically once the structure stabilized. He said he'd done similar things before informally. He said he preferred to find exits. I noticed how carefully he framed the ask as containment, not expansion. There were forms. Contracts. Language I understood well enough to skim, but not well enough to draft myself without time. He offered to handle the administrative side. He said it would save me hours. I let him. The role gave him access. Not to my accounts, but to my network. My name carried weight even when it wasn't attached directly. I watched how easily he navigated that weight, how respectfully he seemed to carry it. He deferred in public. He consolidated in private. At home, nothing changed dramatically. He still didn't stay over often. When he did, he left before dawn. He didn't leave personal items behind. He didn't ask for space in my life. He occupied it without clutter. The first thing that shifted was how often he anticipated my decisions. He began presenting options before I asked for them. Not insisting, just laying them out. If I chose differently, he adjusted without comment. That adaptability felt like competence. He started using phrases I used. Not mimicking, but aligning. When he spoke to others, I heard my language reflected back with slight improvements. It felt collaborative. It also felt efficient. One evening, he mentioned a regulatory gap he'd encountered in a previous role. He said it had nearly cost a fund its tax status. He said the fix had been simple, but expensive if discovered late. He said he'd hate to see something similar happen here. I asked what the fix was. He said a restructuring of how funds were parked between disbursement cycles. He said it required setting up an auxiliary entity. He said it sounded more complex than it was. He sent me a draft that night. Clean. Conservative. Designed to look boring. I appreciated that. The cost was not insignificant, but it was framed as prevention, not investment. I approved it the next day. I didn't tell anyone else. He said discretion mattered. After that, his confidence shifted. Not outwardly. Subtly. He began speaking less about what might happen and more about what would. He still asked my opinion, but the range of options narrowed. He said it was because time mattered now. I trusted that because time usually does. There were moments I registered something like unease. Not fear. Friction. When I asked for documentation, he provided summaries instead. When I asked for names, he gave roles. He said it was cleaner that way. I didn't push. I told myself that my instinct to audit everything was a habit from an earlier phase of my life. That I'd earned the right to delegate. One night, after a long call, he said he appreciated how much latitude I gave him. He said most people needed constant reassurance. He said it was rare to work with someone who understood leverage without trying to own it. He kissed me after that. Slower than usual. I remember thinking that trust, once extended, tended to accelerate systems. I didn't yet see where this one was accelerating to. The first sign wasn't loss. It was delay. A transfer I'd approved didn't clear when it should have. Not a large one, but enough to catch my attention. I asked him about it in passing, assuming a clerical lag. He said the intermediary bank had flagged the transaction for review. He said it happened sometimes when structures were new. He sounded mildly annoyed, which reassured me. Irritation suggested engagement. The delay resolved itself 2 days later. No damage. No fallout. I let it go. After that, the rhythm changed. He began scheduling calls without looping me in. Not meetings I needed to attend, he said. Just technical clarifications. He summarized outcomes afterward efficiently. I noticed how much time that saved me. I also noticed how little raw material I was seeing. When I asked to be copied, he said it might complicate optics. Too many decision makers diluted authority. He said my role was insulation. I let that land as protection. There was an audit request from a minor partner. Routine but poorly timed. He said it could be deferred without consequence. He said engaging now would signal uncertainty. I agreed because uncertainty does travel faster than facts. The auxiliary entity began to do more work than expected. He framed it as optimization. Faster disbursement. Cleaner reporting. He said the original structure was still intact, just less used. I didn't object. Redundancy often looked like intelligence in hindsight. One evening over dinner, he said something that stayed with me. He said that influence worked best when it was invisible. He said the most effective systems were the ones no one thought to question because they felt inevitable. I asked if he was tired. He smiled and said a little. He said this phase required focus. He said it wouldn't last forever. A week later, a board member called me directly. She asked about a document she'd been asked to sign. She said it referenced entities she didn't recognize. She said my name had been used as assurance. I told her I'd look into it. When I asked him that night, he didn't deflect. He explained. He said the document was preliminary. He said my name hadn't been used improperly, just contextually. He said the board member was nervous because she wasn't used to complexity. I asked to see the document. He said he'd send it. He didn't that night. Or the next morning. When it arrived, it wasn't the same version the board member had described. Cleaner. Narrower. Less exposed. He said the earlier draft must have been outdated. That was the moment I felt the shift. Not betrayal. Control. I asked who else had access to the earlier drafts. He said it was difficult to trace. Multiple consultants. Multiple hands. He said that was the risk of scale. I told him I wanted to pause everything. He said pausing would trigger questions. He said questions would invite scrutiny. He said scrutiny, once invited, couldn't be managed. I said that wasn't his call. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. Then he said he understood. He said he'd step back. The next morning, I received 3 emails before 8. One from a partner asking for clarification. One from legal asking for confirmation. One from a regulator requesting documentation I hadn't known existed. The system hadn't paused. It had already learned how to move without me. Once the regulator wrote, the tone changed everywhere at once. I spent the morning on the phone, not explaining, just containing. I said reviews were underway. I said documentation was being assembled. I said very little else. Precision mattered now more than reassurance. He didn't call. At noon, I went to his office. It wasn't a real office, just a lease suite inside a shared compliance firm. His name was still on the directory, printed neatly. The receptionist said he'd stepped out and asked if I wanted to leave a message. I said no. By late afternoon, I had enough to see the outline. The auxiliary entity wasn't auxiliary anymore. It had become the corridor through which most activity passed. Contracts referenced it as if it were foundational. Authority had been routed, not transferred. My name appeared in footnotes and assurances, never as a signer. Protection, he'd called it. I asked legal to reconstruct the chain from the beginning. I asked them not to interpret, just to map. He emailed that evening. Short. He said he was sorry things had escalated. He said he hadn't anticipated the regulator's timing. He said he was confident it would resolve once everyone understood the architecture. I asked him to come over. He arrived calm, not defensive. He sat where he usually did and waited. I told him what I'd seen. I told him the entity no longer matched its stated purpose. I told him my name had been used to quiet resistance. I told him I needed to know whether this had been incompetence or design. He didn't rush to answer. He said systems evolved. He said good ideas were often misunderstood when viewed statically. He said he'd done what he thought was necessary to protect the mission. He said if he'd asked for permission at every step, momentum would have died. I asked whose momentum. He said the works. That was the clearest answer I'd gotten. I told him he no longer had authority to act on my behalf. I told him to disengage immediately. I told him I would be notifying every partner directly. He said that would create exposure. I said exposure already existed. For the first time, his tone shifted. Not angry. Firm. He said walking this back abruptly would look like admission. He said people would ask why I'd allowed it in the first place. He said my reputation was part of the system now, whether I liked it or not. I noticed how carefully he separated himself from that statement. I stood up. I told him to leave. He did, but not before saying one more thing. He said he'd never intended to hurt me. He said he respected me. He said that if I dismantled everything publicly, it would cost more than money. After the door closed, I didn't sit down. I called my attorney. I authorized full disclosure. I told her I wanted daylight, not control. She didn't argue. The next weeks were loud in the way only institutional noise can be. Requests, interviews, clarifications. I answered everything once in writing. I didn't speculate. I didn't defend my judgment. I corrected records. The system unraveled faster than I expected. It turned out he'd been running parallel structures before he met me. Not illegal, just opportunistic. My involvement hadn't created the risk. It had stabilized it long enough to scale. When it was over, the fallout was contained. Expensive, embarrassing, finite. He disappeared before anyone could formally question him. I didn't look for him. When the last letter arrived, I didn't open it immediately. It was a thick envelope from the regulator, the kind that signals conclusion by weight alone. I left it on the hall table and went to the kitchen. I poured water into a glass and drank it standing up. My hands were steady. That was the first thing I noticed. I opened the letter after I sat down. The language was formal and final. Findings noted. Cooperation acknowledged. No further action required. Conditions met. I read it once, then again, not to check meaning but to let my body register that the sequence had ended. I folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't file it. I didn't shred it. I left it where it was. The following days were oddly light. Meetings resumed their previous shape. People spoke to me the way they always had, with the same deference, the same expectation of clarity. A few referenced the situation obliquely. I corrected them gently. I said it was resolved. I didn't expand. At home, I noticed physical shifts. I stopped reviewing documents at night. I slept without waking at 3. The small ache between my shoulders faded. I moved through rooms without anticipating interruption. One evening, I found a notebook I'd used during the worst weeks. Dates. Diagrams. Arrows. I flipped through it once, then closed it. I put it in the back of a drawer, not as evidence, but as proof that the work had been done. What stayed with me wasn't humiliation. It was recognition. I could see now how authority could be borrowed without being stolen. How trust could be converted into momentum without announcing itself as leverage. How competence, when unchallenged, became cover. I didn't rewrite the past to absolve myself. I hadn't been careless. I had been efficient. That distinction mattered. A few weeks later, I attended another board meeting in the same auditorium where I'd first noticed him. The chairs were still uncomfortable. The acoustics still poor. Different agenda. Different names. Someone made a small correction to a date in my report. I thanked them and moved on. Afterward, I walked out alone. I didn't go for a drink. I went home. That night, I took a long shower and stood under the water longer than necessary. My skin warmed. My breathing slowed. There was no surge of relief, no sense of victory. Only a clean, quiet certainty. I stepped out, dried off, and turned off the light in the bathroom. The house held.